Hello, Mishpacha, it's Courtney, America's Jewish Mother. I recently finished 3 novels that all have to do with the subject of racial passing, so I thought it would be interesting to sort of talk about similarities and differences between them, since they all treat this subject and do so in different time periods and from very different lenses. So by the way, there are going to be spoilers in this, just to forewarn you. So the first book was Frances E.W. Harper's novel Iola Leroy, which was published in 1892. The second book was Philip Roth's The Human Stain, which was published in the year 2000 and set during the 1990s. By the way, this Iola Leroy is set during slavery and then after Reconstruction, or during Reconstruction. And then the last one is Brit Bennett's The Vanishing Half, which was published this year and is set during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s in the United States. So first of all, I'm sort of struck by how different Frances E.W. Harper's take on racial passing is than Roth's or Bennett's, and I don't know whether it's just a sort of generational difference, and because, I mean, Roth just passed away, I think, within the last year or two, but possibly because he and Bennett, grew up under, I mean, they weren't in the same time period. Brit Bennett is still a fairly young author, but closer to the same time period than Frances E.W. Harper, who by the time she published this in 1892 was already, I think, 67 years old. So I don't know if it's just because Roth and Bennett grew up in, again, not identical, but more similar to one another circumstances than Frances E.W. Harper did. I'm not exactly sure. But Frances E.W. Harper takes a very moralizing tone to the subject of racial passing, and basically she makes it abundantly clear several times in discussions of this within the novel that if you are in fact part African American, even if you look totally white and you elect to racially pass as white, that is a morally and ethically bankrupt thing to do. And I think Roth and Bennett in their novels are much more, even if they don't necessarily agree with doing it, they're a lot less judgmental about it than Frances Harper. So here are some excerpts I have tabbed from Iola Leroy on the subject of racial passing. So this is Iola's brother Harry going to enlist in the Union Army, and he told the recruiting officer that he wished to be assigned to a colored regiment. "Why do you wish that?" said the officer, looking at Harry with an air of astonishment. "Because I am a colored man." The officer looked puzzled. It was a new experience. He had seen colored men with fair complexions, anxious to lose their identity with the colored race and pose as white men, but here was a man in the flush of his early manhood to whom could come dreams of promotion, from a simple private to a successful general, deliberately turning his back upon every gilded hope and dazzling opportunity to cast his lot with the despised and hated Negro. A little dramatic, but you get the idea. And basically that's kind of the motif that Harper returns to time and time again when this subject comes up in the book, is this idea that it is better to cast your lot with a group of people who are, sort of despised by the world than it is to seek material success and fortune and things like that. So basically it's better to be a martyr than, to have a successful, financially speaking, and social opportunities, in terms of finances and social opportunities. It's better to be a martyr than to have a successful, in that sense, life. So here's another one. Well, maybe if I can get to it. Okay. So this is Iola and his mother Marie and his uncle Robert having a conversation about, you know, his choice not to pass as a white man. So Harry says, "Now that I have linked my fortunes to the race, I intend to do all I can for its elevation." As he spoke, Robert gazed admiringly on the young face, lit up by noble purposes and lofty enthusiasm. "You are right, Harry. I think it would be treason not only to the race but to humanity to have you ignoring your kindred and masquerading as a white man." "I think so too," said Marie. So again, kind of similar to what we saw before. And then Iola has a conversation with Dr. Gresham, who is totally white and is a potential suitor of hers, fairly late in the novel. And again, they're talking about Harry again, Iola's brother. But, answered Dr. Gresham, he being Harry, would possess advantages as a white man which he could not if he were known to be colored. "Doctor," said Iola decidedly, "he has greater advantages as a colored man." "I do not understand you," said Dr. Gresham, looking somewhat puzzled. "Doctor," continued Iola, "I do not think life's highest advantages are those that we can see with our eyes or grasp with our hands. To whom today is the world most indebted, to its millionaires or to its martyrs?" "Taking it from the ideal standpoint," replied the doctor, "I should say its martyrs." "To be," continued Iola, "the leader of a race to higher planes of thought and action, to teach men clear views of life and duty, and to inspire their souls with loftier aims is a far greater privilege than it is to open the gates of material prosperity and fill every home with sensuous enjoyment." So anyway, I've actually marked a couple more passages, but basically, hopefully you kind of get the idea. All of them kind of go in that same vein, that it's better for you to sacrifice yourself and give your life meaning and also uplift the entire African American race than it is for you to pursue material and social gain through racially passing as white when you have even one drop of African American blood. And honestly, according to the one drop rule anyway, if you were found out to have even one drop of African American blood, you would be considered black anyway. And that's actually I will read one more excerpt. This is where Dr. Gresham is trying to get Iola to marry him, and she won't because she just feels like the fact that she is part African American is too insurmountable of a barrier to pass between them, even if he's willing to overlook it. So Iola says to Dr. Gresham, "This prejudice against the colored race environs our lives and mocks our aspirations." And the doctor replies, "Iola, I see no use in you persisting that you are colored when your eyes are as blue and complexion as white as mine." And that's actually an interesting point because, again, Gresham here is pointing to the fact that race is socially constructed rather than biologically constructed, right? Like, if she looks white to everyone else, then she's white. But anyway, so Iola then responds, "Doctor, were I your wife, are there not people who would caress me as a white woman, who would shrink from me in scorn if they knew I had one drop of Negro blood in my veins? When mistaken for a white woman, I should hear things alleged against the race at which my blood would boil. No, doctor, I am not willing to live under a shadow of concealment." So anyway, so that's kind of how Harper treats this notion of racial passing in Iola Leroy, that it is a moral and ethical question, and that if you did decide to racially pass, that basically you're this like morally bankrupt person who cares more about social and economic success than you do about loftier ideals of racial uplift and, you know, ethically defending your race and stuff like that. So it's very much in contrast with how Roth and Bennett view it, who again, even though they're approaching it from very different positionalities, Roth, you know, at the time that he published The Human Stain was already probably in his like 60s or 70s, this Jewish man who was already a pretty well respected and renowned writer at this point. And Brit Bennett is a fairly young African American woman, and Vanishing Half is her second novel that, like I said, just came out this year. But both of them as writers seem more sympathetic to, again, even if they don't totally agree with it, the choice to racially pass in order to pursue these sort of material and social successes, and also to pursue life on your own terms, which is not something that Frances Harper talks about. So here are some, and by the way, I'll also go ahead and say, because I said there were going to be spoilers in this, so in Roth, The Human Stain, the main character, Coleman Silk, is passing as white, and he's also passing as a white Jewish man, even though he grew up in a very light-skinned African-American family. And then similarly to Brit Bennett's character, Stella, who also is a very light-skinned African-American woman who decides to pass as white. So both of them, give up their families in order to pass as white. Their spouses have no idea of their racial background. Children have no idea about their racial background, and so they just are keeping all of this a secret, or attempting to. So here are some things that Roth says about this idea. So for him, it seems more tied to freedom and the ability to make of your life what you will than it does to any sort of moral or ethical question, or even the idea that you would pass for, social and material benefits. So he writes, he recognized that to conventional people for whom everything was ready-made and rigidly unalterable, what he was doing would never look correct. But to dare to be nothing more than correct had never been his aim. The objective was for his fate to be determined not by the ignorant, hate-filled intentions of a hostile world, but, to whatever degree humanly possible, by his own resolve. Why accept a life on any other terms? So, again, for Coleman, this idea of passing is really tied to the ability to live his life on his own terms, and even the fact that he takes on this identity as a white Jewish man as opposed to just a wasp or something, is also sort of tied up in this question of, no, I'm going to create my own identity and no one's going to tell me otherwise. So another quotation from The Human Stain. They called themselves what they called themselves freely, without asking permission or seeking approval from what her father contemptuously described as the hypocritical enemies of everything that was natural and good, namely officialdom, those illegitimately holding the power. So here we kind of see this idea of racially passing as like sticking it to the man, as it were, right? So that people who do have power got it through illegitimate purposes, or illegitimate means anyway, so there's no reason to not attempt to live your life on your own terms, even if you have to give up things in order to do that. And then a little later on, Coleman thinks, what he learned in the Navy is that all you have to do is give a pretty good and consistent line about yourself, and nobody ever inquires because no one's that interested. Which I think is something that Stella from Brit Bennett's The Vanishing Half also kind of finds to be true, although in the case of her daughter Kennedy, she does inquire a lot more than anyone else would. And then there was one more quotation I wanted to quote from here, from The Human Stain. The act was committed in 1953 by an audacious young man in Greenwich Village, by a specific person in a specific place at a specific time, but now he will be over on the other side forever. Yet that, as he discovers, is exactly the point. Freedom is dangerous. Freedom is very dangerous, and nothing is on your own terms for long. And this idea of committing an action at a certain point in history and then it being kind of belonging irrevocably to history after that, and being sort of subsumed into the flux of things, and you not necessarily knowing the repercussions that it's going to have, and it's not always going to be on your own terms, really reminds me a lot of War and Peace by Tolstoy. This idea that once you commit an action that it belongs to history, it's not your individual action, and it may well have even been predetermined. And then a sort of similar quotation from The Human Stain, and this is the last one before I'm going to move on to The Vanishing Half. The man who decides to forge a distinct historical destiny, who sets out to spring the historical lock, and who does so brilliantly succeeds at altering his personal lot, only to be ensnared by the history he hadn't quite counted on. The history that isn't yet history, the history that the clock is now ticking off, the history proliferating as I write, accruing a minute at a time and grasped better by the future than it will ever be by us. The we that is inescapable, the present moment, the common lot, the current mood, the mind of one's own country, the stranglehold of history that is one's own time, blindsided by the terrifyingly provisional nature of everything. So Roth seems to be taking a somewhat divergent line from Tolstoy in War and Peace, right? So Tolstoy was kind of saying, once you perform an action, it irrevocably belongs to history where it has this predetermined significance. And Roth is sort of saying, okay, so yeah, I think he somewhat agrees with that, but then he's also saying everything is so sort of contingent and provisional, and you never sort of know what's going to happen once you decide to commit yourself to a choice, even if you do so in the name of freedom. And then finally, Brit Bennett's The Vanishing Half. So we have these two light-skinned African-American sisters. One of them, Stella, decides to pass as white. She does not tell her husband or her daughter about her racial background. And in fact, she even, again, light spoilers, acts in a racist way, like to African-Americans, I guess in order to sort of shield herself from any scrutiny or anything like that. And so I want to read some quotes that I think kind of consider why Stella would make this choice, whereas Desiree, her sister, makes a complete opposite choice. She marries a very dark-skinned African-American man, has a daughter who is very dark-skinned, and ends up basically going back to her hometown of Mallard and kind of living out her days there. Not probably the life she had thought of for herself, but it seems to work out okay for her. So anyway, so this is what Brit Bennett writes about Stella. There was nothing to being white except boldness. You could convince anyone you belonged somewhere if you acted like you did. So I thought that was an interesting commentary on whiteness, this idea that there's this sort of privilege inherent to whiteness that you would never question whether you belong or not. You would just assume that you did and go throughout life that way. And I think in some ways, Coleman Silk from Roth's The Human Stain has always operated in terms of living his life on those terms. He's always just assumed that yes, this is what I'm doing, and no one's gonna question me about it or anything like that. So I thought that was interesting. Then Brit Bennett also writes, the hardest part about becoming someone else was deciding to, the rest was only logistics. And then later she writes, you didn't just find a self out there waiting, you had to make one, you had to create who you wanted to be. So again, Stella's decision to pass as white is really tied up with these questions of identity and choice and having the freedom to make your own choices. And while it does seem like Stella's choice is based at least partially on the idea of having greater financial success and socio-cultural opportunities as a white woman than she would as an African-American woman, it seems more like I said, the fact that this idea of passing as white equates to freedom in her mind, and that's definitely what it's like for Coleman Silk and Roth's The Human Stain. One thing I thought was interesting about the differences between these two characters is that Coleman really never seems to worry that his wife or kids or anyone is going to find out his secret. I mean, it maybe comes up like 2 or 3 times in the whole novel, but it's never, he never really thinks too hard about it. And I don't know whether that's because men just tend to be more confident in general about things than women, or because Roth is this Jewish man writing this, and so he's not necessarily thinking about how much this would kind of dog you or eat at you if you were hiding something about your racial background from everyone around you. But Bennett's character Stella definitely feels the heat and the weight of hiding this secret about her home and her family and her racial background, and it definitely starts to eat away at her marriage and her relationship with her daughter Kennedy, because it's like the whole thing is built on lies. So I thought that was an interesting distinction between them. So yeah, I don't really know that I have any final thoughts. Just again, I did think it was interesting that Bennett and Roth were sort of closer in their portrayals of passing and why someone would choose to racially pass, even though, you know, black youngish woman versus older Jewish white guy, right? So even though they come from very, very different positionalities in that respect, I did think it was interesting that their concepts of why someone would choose to do this as portrayed in these books were closer to one another than they were to Frances E.W. Harper's, who again was sort of very thinking about it from a moral and ethical standpoint, and like almost like a spiritual sense, right? Like that it's better for you to make your lot with your own people and try to do right by them, rather than to pursue moral or, I mean, material or social success, because that would make you a morally bankrupt person. So yeah, anyway, if you've read any of these books, I would be super curious to hear your thoughts down in the comments below on how racial passing is portrayed in any one or all of these books. And yeah, hope you're doing well. I hope you're doing good reading. And until next time, would it kill you to call you mother?